Hello and welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable with Matthew and Andrew as your hosts again this episode. And with us, we've got a guest. We've got Tom from the Hidden in Plain Sight podcast. Some of you may have heard that introduced on Justin's Unbelievable podcast, or you may have found his podcast separately. However you came across his podcast, we enjoyed it. We wanted to get Tom on to have a conversation. So welcome, Tom.
Hi, yeah, good to be with you.
And a glorious Welsh accent as well. So I'm very glad to hear a Welsh accent on podcast land.
Yeah, it's just funny you should say that. It just occurred to me now, I don't actually listen to any sort of Welsh-based podcasts myself. So yeah, I feel a bit like a traitor. I don't actually subscribe. I don't know if there are any other sort of Welsh podcasts. I'm sure there are.
There must be. Do you speak Welsh at all?
No, I'm not. So I'm from a part of South Wales that there's not a huge amount of Welsh speakers. So I grew up in between Cardiff and Swansea, which is limited Welsh speaking. So the further west you go or the further north you go, you get a lot more. But yeah, no, I missed out on Welsh school.
Yeah, I did spend a lot of time in Wales, but I was born in North Wales. So I do, when the rugby's on, I make sure that I plant the flag of my Welsh heritage firmly and make sure everybody knows about it.
Oh, brilliant.
But other than that, I've got very little claim to being Welsh, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, putting on the red jersey on Rugby Day, that's a good start, Matthew.
Yeah, it is. It's mandatory, isn't it? And just to keep the connection in, I'm in coastal Somerset, so on a good fine day, I can stand on the beach and wave across the water at Cardiff.
Right. Yeah. Well, my hometown, I grew up on the beach, so I probably had the opposite view, but right back at you. So yeah.
Excellent. So we can have a good ding dong about who had the best view, then, can't we? Right. So yeah. So your podcast. I heard about your podcast from Justin's Unbelievable, which is why I mentioned it in the intro, and I went straight in and listened to it. I genuinely enjoyed listening to it, and I thought the quality of the production was high. I was quite surprised when you told Andrew and myself before we hit record that this was your first foray into podcasting world, and you did a lot of learning from scratch and did your own investigation. Got your own tools and sorted it out. So kudos and well done for that. I think the result shows that. There was a couple of questions that have come up to me, and they're in no particular order. But I'll hit the songs question first. So because you mentioned in the podcast that the songs that you feature, I think you said when describing the songs, you created them yourselves. Can you just fill me in on the process that was and who you got involved with?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thanks for any the feedback on the production. I would just make a comment about that for anyone who's listening, who's got an instinct that maybe they want to actually make a podcast themselves. I stood on the shoulders of giants in many ways, because there's so much, as we were chatting before we came on, there is so much good tutorial stuff out there. We're living through a bit of a golden patch, I think, and I learned everything pretty much from YouTube. All the software I used is open source. I used a piece of software called Audacity, which you could go and download now. So if you've got a little bit of time and you're keen and you've got something to say, I think it's a great time to start a podcast. So yeah, thanks for that. And I just did it from a cold start. On the song stuff, yeah, I use we because I mean, it's mostly me, but I sort of, when you say I too much, sometimes it gets a little bit embarrassing. So how the songs would work is so I would write lyrics and come up with sort of some of the basic concept for songs, and then depending on which song we're talking about, I either use some songwriting collaboration for groups that you can use. So I joined a sort of songwriters group, and you can liaise with like instrumentalists and things like that. And so some of the songs I managed to set up for free and sort of partnered with people. Others I used a website called Air Gigs, which it's also like semi-professional, sometimes amateur people looking for a few extra pounds who are sort of instrumentalists, and I kind of built the songs up from scratch. So I would go with lyrics and actually how I want the song to be sung, and then maybe I'd find a guitarist who was maybe looking for some extra cash, and I'd hire them to make the music. And you can cobble together songs and build songs up from the ground up that way if you don't know anyone in the industry, or you don't have a musical background like I didn't. I just had some ideas for stuff, so I did it via that method because I really wanted some to music, and I wanted that to be part of the fun that I could have making it. So I just took the time to do that. And to be honest, it almost took as much time to do that as it did the podcast. So it wasn't an easy thing to do, but I got a massive kick out of it. So yeah, I'll be doing that for future series as well. It was a lot of fun.
Wow, well done. That wasn't the answer that I was expecting. I'm even more impressed with what you've produced for your podcast.
Oh right, what just out of interest, what did you think? Because I'm interested in how when people hear it, what people think it is, how the music gets made.
I expected that you had connections to existing bands, because they sound, most of the songs sound like they were created by and sung by a Christian band. And so I assumed
that was my
you had a
anticipation
connection
as well. Yeah.
Right. No, it's
sorry.
yeah. You just each instrument pretty much in the thing is a different person in a different place most of the time. So you kind of hire different people in, and I hired a vocalist, and a lot of the people on air gigs are American. So it's really hard to find someone who doesn't sound like a Christian singer. A lot of the ways the people sing on there did. I didn't actually intend some of the songs to come out as sort of Christian rock as they did, but as it did happen, I sort of ran with it because I thought actually this kind of fits with the show a little bit. But in series 2, I've started making the music already. That's going to have a different sound because it's not about Christianity. So I want the music to sound slightly different.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to that. So you mixed all of those. No, you go, Andrew.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to ask a little bit about the music production there. So you mixed all of those tracks individually. They were laid down, so that the instrumental track and the vocal tracks were laid down separately and mixed them behind the scenes.
Yeah, no. So I'd work with each of the artists, mostly some of the songs it was only like 2 people, and a couple of them it was sort of 4, 5, and then I had a regular guy who great actually. There's a link to him on my website called Jeremiah Estates, who's just really good value for money sound mixer. Like, you know, we're talking really reasonable, like $30 and stuff like that. So he would mix all the songs. So once I'd get it to a place where we'd done all of the instruments and all the vocals and all that sort of stuff, I would send it to him, and then he would sort of mix it together. So he was awesome. So by the time it got back from him, it really sounded like a song that maybe could have been done in a studio. Not quite, but almost there, you know.
Yeah, I think it's worth giving a shout out there, because for how that was put together, it really was well done. So congratulations on a production quality that really was worth listening to. And by the way, maybe this is a good point for you to just give your podcast name for everyone that's listening, just in case they're still Unbelievable listeners who haven't come across your Unbelievable episode.
Yeah, sure. So it's Hiding in Plain Sight, and most of the stuff goes, there's hips in most of the things, obviously Hiding in Plain Sight. So it's abbreviated. So the website is hipspodcast.com. So you can check that out. My Twitter is at Tom Hips Podcast, and you can also email me, tom@hipspodcast.com. So yeah, that's the podcast if anyone wants to go and listen to it if they haven't already.
Good deal. Sorry, Matthew.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I was going to jump track, but maybe this is a question for later on in the episode. But are you able to give any spoilers or clues as to what we might expect for series 2?
Yeah, I'm such a tease. No, I'm not going to say actually, Matthew. I'm going to wait a little bit. I'm almost certain. I'm having some conversations and just sort of working out if it is what I want to do, and I'm almost ready to sort of say, oh, this is what I'm going to do for the next series. But because the setup time is so long, you know, there's nothing quick about what I've chosen to do. It's not an easy, you know, if you really wanted to set up a podcast where people would listen to regularly, you wouldn't do it this way. So I've got to go away. I've got to also have the life experiment, which will, you know, probably take 2 to 3 months. Christian one was longer, but I think next time I'll probably condense it into sort of 3 months, and then I've got to then also do all the post production on it. So there's quite a way away. So I'm gonna hold my cards close to my chest for a little bit longer.
That's perfectly fair. Yes, keep them wanting more is the old adage, and it works. So I'm quite fine with that. And I'm aware of how long it takes. So Andrew and I both do. We share the editing loads for these podcasts, and yeah, it takes time.
Yeah,
there's no short way around it.
Yeah, for the rest of this podcast, I think I'll just call you Shaman Tom. Thinking Okay, maybe not. But so, Matthew, there's probably some interesting ground as transition there into the conversation, because, Tom, you just said that, the experiment, the sort of life experiment as a Christian took a little while. And so what were you prior to the experiment if you were not a Christian? And what caused the experiment?
I guess I describe myself as an atheist. I'm kind of fast and loose to the atheist agnostic. I know that jars with some people, but I don't believe in God. I didn't believe in God going into it. I'm not a religious person, so I wouldn't call myself a Christian going into it. In terms of why I did it, I mean the base level reason is probably unrelated. It's more sort of ego based. I wanted to do something creative, and I had this urge to do something that was different from my everyday day job life. You get to sort of 30 years old, and you suddenly think, do you know what? It'd be really interesting to do something a little bit different. So I had that kind of pre-midlife crisis, and so I kind of looked around for ideas. What could I do? And podcast seemed like a great option because, one, I love podcasts, so I kind of thought I might have an idea about what good looked like because, I like you guys, I'm an avid podcast listener. So I think I understood what maybe that I could add something to it because I appreciated podcasts. So that was the basic impetus for it. And then it was just a question of, okay, well, what could I do? I've been listening to Unbelievable, the podcast that you guys obviously have listened to over the years as well. I listened to that for a long time. And so I was interested in that idea of stepping into sort of another man's shoes, so trying to see something from someone else's perspective. But I didn't want to necessarily add anything to the kind of belief debate, if you like, the kind of maybe the sort of hard intellectual side of things. Not because I find that uninteresting, I find it really interesting, but I just felt like I don't think I could have added anything better to it. So I thought, well, what else could I do? And I thought, well, maybe a more practical sort of fly on the wall type thing might be interesting. So I sort of came up with that idea and thought, well, I'll just sort of run with that. So that's kind of how I got to that point of thinking about actually doing a life experiment. I had an interest in Christianity because I'd been listening to Unbelievable and I'd read stuff about it. And then I kind of thought, well, what would be another interesting way of looking at the topic?
So I think that is interesting. At least it was for me, because we spend a lot of time sort of intellectualizing about the difference in worldviews, right? The skeptical worldview versus the Christian worldview, whether you're a dualist or a substance realist, or whatever your intellectual flavor of Christianity is. On Sunday mornings, something drives you out of bed, right? And it's probably not that you're a dualist or you're a substance dualist or whatever you are, right? Something else is probably the thing that causes you to get up on Sunday mornings and to say your prayers, at bedtime, right? And so I think that's a good instinct, that there are motivators in Christianity that are deeper than just this the sort of intellectual debate that we carry on, pretty frequently.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Andrew. I think, at least for myself, my personal take is, what it's helped me to do, one of the great sort of spin-offs, if you like. It wasn't really an intended goal, but with the sort of benefits I've had is it's helped me recognize where else in my life maybe I do things sort of for more emotional reasons. I think I probably, like you, would agree that I don't think, at least for myself, or even for the Christians I met, I don't think the intellectual is always the primary driver behind why people go to church or why people become Christians, or why I even do a bunch of the stuff I do. I think we are quite emotional beasts, and doing this made me realize that even more.
Yeah. And I think in the tale of Christian conversions, I think Matthew and I share this. And maybe you encountered this in your journey over this season at Hips. The Christian conversion stories are rarely, though I admit sometimes they are, about very intellectual drivers, like minimum basic facts for the resurrection of Jesus, or whatever thing floats a person's boat, right? But usually Conversion stories are about an experience, right? And that experience is, we might call those experiences into question. Certainly I do. But Christianity, in my experience, is much more driven by some set of internal emotions. And that's not to say that there aren't good Christian thinkers out there. I think there are good Christian thinkers out there, even if we disagree. But it seems to be the emotion, someone died, right? Someone was willing to give up their life for someone else. And that's quite a strong story, even if I don't think that the story, it doesn't motivate me, because I don't think there's any truth behind it. But Christianity does have a very strong emotional appeal.
I do agree with that, Andrew. And I think the thing that struck me as I was going through it is I really set out with this idea, which I talk about a little bit in episode 1, of what, and I refer to them as like belief bugs. Like that's the kind of analogy I think I use, is like, you need to park a certain amount of your beliefs in order to progress. I think if you're going to do something like a life experiment, you can't be constantly questioning everything that comes at you that you would normally have qualms with, because I think the question I asked myself, what happens if I park some of my beliefs, or what happens if I stop questioning everything just for a moment and then just let some of the other experiences take over? I was really interested in those other experiences. I didn't want to stop at every point and go, oh wow, that's a virgin birth, that doesn't sound right. Oh my God, an angel's just struck someone dumb over here. All these stories, they sound, when you break them down like that, they sound, the Christmas story can sound ridiculous in some sense. And I talk about that in episode 3. It can sound hocus pocus and sort of bonkers, but when you stop worrying about that a little bit, as a non-believer anyway, obviously Christians need to worry about it, but as a non-believer, you're privileged enough not to have to worry about it. You can then look beyond and say, well, what actually is the Christmas story trying to say? And then it starts to become interesting, I think, and then it starts to sort of add some value to you, because you can actually start to see a bit of a sort of richer picture. So I certainly took that approach of parking some of my skepticism and sort of unapologetically then looking for value within Christianity. So there's a sort of I'm mining for gold in some sense throughout this series.
That's a really good point, and I echo the comments about emotion. When I was a Christian, it was a very emotional commitment, and the path out of Christianity was fraught with lots of emotion too. But the question I'd like to ask, and this was a comment that I made to you when I first connected to you with email, and you very graciously corrected me in email. So I'd like to just bring this out for people to listen to. The impression that I got from listening to it, and it touches on what you were saying about suspending and engaging with the stories and the emotions of the various Christians you met, and I got that from the way that you did talk to Christians and from the narrative that you proposed. So when I finished listening to it, I completely misunderstood you as an individual, and I came away from it thinking, this is a guy who's got a soft spot for Christianity. He wants to convert to Christianity, and he's very kindly recorded his conversion experience for everybody. And that was the impression I came away with. That. Are you aware that anybody else has jumped to that same conclusion?
Oh yeah, for sure. I my best friend, the best man at my wedding, has the exact same view of humanity. So we have this sort of running joke where he's waiting for me to come out of the closet. I mean, he's sort of half tongue in cheek about it. He's an atheist, slightly more sort of staunch one than me, I guess. But he thinks the whole thing's been just me smuggling in my Christianity. So I've kind of enjoyed that. I've enjoyed letting him dangle, and in some sense I kind of like the fact that was your view of it as well. I think there's something interesting about the fact that we struggle to understand. I don't know if this was what you were doing, but I think for my friend, I can at least say this. I think he might struggle to understand why you would bother to do it if you don't want to become a Christian. And for me, that was the opposite of what I was trying to do. I didn't have a goal in mind. I wasn't trying to reach some sort of nice, neat ending. And if you've listened to the whole series, and so for anyone who's listened to the whole series, you understand it kind of it's fairly ambiguous ending. It's not, I don't wrap things up in a nice, neat bow. I just kind of arrive at some thoughts, really. And for me, I think that was always the point. I think good journeys are about, it's the cliche. It's about the journey. It's not really about sort of at the end, becoming a Christian and then just going, oh, isn't it fantastic? I kind of went because I genuinely just wanted to sort of experience what it might be like. So I'm not a Christian now. I wouldn't call myself a Christian now. I'm, spoiler alert for anyone who wants to watch the series, but I don't convert at the end. But that was never really the point.
Okay, but next season. Oh, sorry.
No, I just wanted to echo. You did leave it hanging at the end. I'll acknowledge that you did, and I was a little bit confused because by the time it got to the end, I was almost at the point where I was anticipating you announcing a conversion towards the end, and I won't say disappointed, although it's possible that some of your listeners might have been, but I was, you left us hanging, and you didn't form a firm conclusion either way, and you've probably dialed back into the whole, leave them wanting more, because I wanted a conclusion.
Yeah, although I guess so. Go on, sorry, Andrew.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say next season, I want you to do Satanism, leave it with the same cliffhanger. So that's a vote from one of your listeners. Is next season, can you convince your friend that you're now a Satanist?
Yeah. I'm interested. We have some conversations.
Like in there. It's the Mac OS user that's recommending Satanism on that. Just throw that.
Me and my friend, we have some quite interesting conversations about the next topic as well. So, I have an opportunity to leave him dangling there as well, I think.
That'll be fun to listen to. You got me, Matthew. I have absolutely nothing to say except that the truth is that the nuns are on the rise. And so if the Christians are right and the nuns are actually just those who have been persuaded by Satan, then us Mac users are going to win.
I don't think I've got to come back to that
one. So sorry, Tom. This is a constant ongoing. This is an ongoing thread.
Yeah, we normally reserve it for our other podcast, plug Ask an Atheist Anything, but it's clearly going to spill over, and this is that.
Yeah, all bleeds into one.
Yeah, exactly. So, Matthew, you were going to ask Tom something, and I sort of got in the way of that, so my apology.
Yes, I probably was. Yes, there's lots of questions. Do you have a demographic breakdown on your listeners, Tom? Is there an atheist Christian split? Are you aware of?
I have an instinct. Yeah, no, I have an instinctive one, but no real good data. I mean, I haven't really invested in like podcast stats. I mean, I get some basic stuff through the website or through the sort of the storage thing I used for podcasts, but so you get some really rough numbers of geography and things like that. And the mostly I think 2/3 of the listeners are North American, which is probably through the sort of unbelievable route, because obviously a lot of people who listen to it through that show I think are North American listeners as well. So I can get some geography stuff, but no demographics. But instinctively, based on my messages via Twitter and people who've messaged me, I'd say it's largely Christian at the moment. So I think there's probably definitely less non-believers messaging me about stuff. There's some, but it's probably something like 20 to 30% non-believers, I'd say, if I was just to guess and shoot from the hip on it.
I'm not surprised by those numbers, to be honest, Tom. There is a challenge in crossover in podcasting world. If you plant yourself as an atheist podcast, you're going to struggle to get Christian listeners, because why would they want to listen to you if all you're going to do is bash their firmly held beliefs? They're not going to listen to you for punishment, and it's the same the other way around. And my exit from Christianity, if I map the podcast I listened to when I was a Christian, I searched for lots of Christian podcasts, and there was a select few science ones, and crept into a couple of recommended atheist ones that like what's one of the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe is one, and I struggled. It wasn't a pleasure for me listening to atheists critiquing my religion. It was cognitive dissonance is probably the appropriate phrase for that. I just didn't enjoy it, and several I stopped listening to. As that journey progressed, it swung the other way, and Unbelievable is the only religious podcast that I listen to religiously. There are very few other religious podcasts that I spend any time on. There's a couple I subscribe to, but I don't listen to every episode. I just dip in when it's a subject that interests me.
Yeah, I'm the same. I think Unbelievable is a bit of an outlier like that. Justin's done something pretty decent in terms of sort of making those conversations really attractive. I even bizarrely have found myself over the years listening to the episodes where it's just two Christians as well. I think it's because you suddenly get into a podcast it's so much, and I've been listening to it for so long, that you just even keep listening to the episodes where there's no debate, or it is a debate that's just about Christian philosophy or something like that. I even sometimes listen to those. So yeah, they're doing something pretty special. But I do think, just to comment on that, and I don't listen to any other religious podcasts, I think, myself either, but I do think there's the thing that my takeaway is there's a real opportunity, I think, in engaging with a religion, even if your purpose is nothing to do with being converted. I think one of my takeaways is that I wish I'd done it sooner. I'm glad I've got a better appreciation of Christianity. I mean, it's such a big deal as a faith. So to have a slightly deeper understanding of why people do what they do, and also what they get out of it, which is the big one. I'm kind of pleased that I did. So I do think there's something. I think we might lose something by if you're right and people do stick to their kind of siloed listening groups, and they don't really listen out of that a lot. I think there's something that either side is maybe missing out on a little bit in that.
I want to echo that. Yes, it's important if we're going to expand our appreciation and our knowledge, and yes, even our learning, we need to cross over those boundaries and engage and take the risk on what it is. Andrew and I have both been on forums where we've discussed podcasts, and we've had Christians tell us that they have no intention of listening to our podcast, but that doesn't stop them talking about it. But they flatly refuse to listen to it. And I think that's a shame, frankly.
Yeah, and I don't know what you guys think about it, but obviously, there's probably something in the way that the conversation has gone. I'm not a huge student of it, but I think I know enough about how some prominent atheists and how some prominent Christian speakers, how they frame their output, and how it's the kind of the angle they put on it. Sometimes some of the stuff you see, like for example on Twitter, I've only joined Twitter. I'm not a big social media person. I've kind of joined obviously to help promote the podcast, and so it's been relatively new to me. Some of this output you see on there is, you just think, well, you're not really leaving much room for someone to join in, because it's so, I don't know what the word is, but it's so kind of jarring, or it's deliberately it's provocative beyond maybe what it needs to be. I think there's some interesting ways to be provocative, but sometimes it seems like being provocative sake isn't really going to bring people in to listen to something new and help people sort of experience something new. So I think it's beholden on the listener to try and step across the aisle, as you put it, a little bit, and also people producing stuff. I think even if your show is about non-belief, I think there's probably ways of doing it that can leave a bit of a door open to allow people in, and not just not doing a way that makes people feel too uncomfortable or what have you. So I think there's kind of there's a responsibility on both sides a little bit for me.
I would wholly endorse that comment.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't mind me batting that particular ball back and just asking what your experience was on the journey, right? So we've talked a little bit about how people experience podcasts and how podcasters can help reach across the aisle, right? But in some sense, your journey was the non-digital part of that, right? Where you're doing this thing in real life. And so how did you experience that on your journey? How well were you received by Christians, and did they know while you were on this exploration that you were a non-Christian?
Yeah, so I think it was a very fortuitous first topic because obviously I was making all sorts of mistakes, in terms of how I went about my method of doing it. And I was kind of just really learning on the hoof, as we've chatted about. And because I don't know what it's like in the States, and maybe Christianity, the way it sort of is in the culture is different in America than it is here. I'm not sure, but certainly for the Christians in where I live in South London, the sort of the churches, the 5 or 6 churches that I probably went to, they're pretty reasonable and quite polite people. I mean, British people tend to be fairly mild in general anyway, and the Christianity can be, although at least my experience of it was. So I found I was always welcomed in. I told people at every stage what I was doing. I would often speak to sort of like the head pastor and things like that, and just make sure that they were happy about me bringing stuff into church and recording and things like that. So I was fairly open about it. And Christians, one of their things I think is that they want to tell people about the good news and what they think is the most important conversation piece of all time. For them, it's the big thing to talk about. So I didn't have any issues really getting people to engage with me. I'm not sure for the second series I'll have it so easy. So I'm taking a little bit more time to sort of arrange permissions and things like that. But I think for a startup series, because of the way sort of British Christians are, or at least the Christians in my experience anyway are, it was a really nice, smooth sort of experience in terms of people were just happy to sort of tell me their story and let me kind of go at my own pace, if that makes sense.
It does. I think one of the potential differences in the United States is that it's a much bigger landmass. And why that matters is because we have a lot more rural area, and rural communities tend to be more conservative than cosmopolitan or metro communities. And so I think if you just brought hips to the U.S., right, which might not be a bad contrast at some point in the future, right? If you had a couple of months to spend over here, it might be an interesting season to walk through the Christian experiment again from an American perspective. But I think the thing that you would see is that cosmopolitan Christianity is largely no different between here and there, even if some of the ideologies are a little more closely held. But when you get out into rural communities, you're very, very likely to experience a different, more fundamental, and in some sense, more sinners in the hands of an angry God kind of Christianity. So I think that would probably be the difference, but it'd be an experiment worth running.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I
recently I was on a podcast called Proselytize and Apostatize with 2 American Christians who were the hosts, and they really echoed what you were saying, actually, Andrew. I think they were kind of surprised that I mostly found sort of people similar to myself, if you like, in some sense. Obviously, there were Christians that I met and they were different, but largely kind of we had a lot of common ground. They were kind of surprised by that, being Americans, and they found that not only do they argue internally with other Christians, but obviously they bump up against sort of non-Christians in a much more sort of energetic way. So yeah, I recognize that, and that might be an interesting idea. Or maybe someone in America might want to do something like that. I don't know about your view, Matthew. I think obviously you're being in Somerset, so there is a sort of famous rural thing, but you can't really get too rural in the UK. You're always quite close to some sort of large town or city so you can't sort of like, your ideas can't go off on too many tangents in the UK. You're always close to some sort of normality, if that makes sense.
Yes,
I don't know if that's your experience. Obviously, Somerset's pretty rural, but
it is. It's certainly rural in the Parliament, although I am on the coast, so I'm part of a medium-sized town. But yeah, go a couple of miles inland onto the levels, and yes, you get little hamlets and villages. And the village tends to congregate around a single pub, which might also be next door to the church, kind of thing. And Yeah, but in terms of, but the church structure in the UK, I think is also very different to the church structure in America. That Andrew may have to correct me on this, but certainly with the Church of England, we've got a governing body, so all the churches, so they have a what's the word, a pyramid of authority. So the churches in an area, the vicars on all those churches, they all report to a regional minister or a regional vicar. I know somebody who has this role actually, but I can't even remember what it's called. And so you've got that cycle up. So churches are looked after. So going off on tangents, etc., is less likely to happen. It's similar with the Baptist Church in the UK as well. They've got the similar sort of thing. That's where you've got a regional minister who oversees the various Baptist churches in that area. And I believe most of the organised religious organised Christian religions, you know what I mean, the denominations, that's what I was after. They all have a very similar structure. I think the only area where that differs is where you've got what we call free churches or house churches, and I think those are the only ones where they don't have somebody to oversight to, and I think those are the ones where there is potentially a risk of them moving off mainstream Christianity into more interesting areas of religion.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know what you think about it, Matthew. But I think my experience of, albeit it is still brief, and you obviously, if you were a previous Christian, you've probably got a deeper understanding than me. But so Christianity has now arrived at, because it's sort of it's dwindled and it's lost its influence in the UK over time, and we've secularized as a country. But it's arrived at this kind of interesting sweet spot almost, where it's still quite a big deal. Obviously, the church is still a huge entity, and politically, it's woven into our DNA in some sense, and it obviously it owns a lot of land, and so it's got means. Albeit it still kind of sits under the culture a little bit, because we're quite a secular culture day to day in the UK. If you don't go to a church, then it doesn't really feel too often like a Christian country, which I don't know, parts of the States might feel a bit more Christian. So Christianity's kind of got this interesting, like, sort of large minority sort of position, which I think is always quite an interesting position for anything to be in, is where you're quite a big minority and you can kind of play an interesting sort of opposition role to the culture. And one of the things that I found was holding it up as, and I talk about this in the last series, is holding it up as a devil's advocate for myself as an individual. I wasn't taking stuff on wholesale, but I was sort of letting it challenge me and let some of the ideas challenge me was quite useful. And I think if you scaled that up, to sort of a more kind of a community level, I think Christianity has an important role for me in modern British culture, because it's in a position where it's not really holding the reins, but it's a big enough voice to have an influence. And the best bits of it, not all the bits of it, but the best bits of it are countercultural in a good way. Some of the things around grace and the way we view vulnerable individuals, and some of the sort of messages around forgiveness of Christianity, some of these things, how they manifest themselves in communities, that there's some quite important ideas there. And so I think it's an interesting, I don't know what your view is, but I think it's an interesting time for British Christians because of just the kind of the shape of it now, in modern times. It's a sort of interesting period in its history, I think.
Yeah, so there are occasional clashes, but I would go along with most of that. It is culturally significant, but it's not critical to our culture. But there are areas where I think politicians need to engage sympathetically with Christians if they want to get a vote, for example. And a couple of issues that jump out. Well, the abortion issue is the most obvious one. I think there are enough Christians in this country that if somebody came out strongly in favour of extending abortion limits, that there would be significant numbers of Christians who would just not vote for him on that comment alone. But there are other issues also which are important to Christians. So one particularly that I can think of is foreign aid. As part of the government policy in this country, we give a certain percentage of our GDP as foreign aid to third world countries, and there are Christians who want to see that percentage maintained, and any politician that would argue against maintaining that level would lose a vote of a significant number of the Christians in the country. So there are some issues which are key and Christians hold quite strongly, and some we can engage on. I think that the foreign aid one is probably one that doesn't need to cross religious boundaries. Sorry, I phrased that poorly. It doesn't need to be just within a religious boundary. It can go cross-cultural. I'm sure there are plenty of atheists who would be very, very happy to agree with and support that particular policy. It doesn't need to be just a Christian policy. There's something else I was going to go on to, but my misspeak has lost my train of thought. Did you have anything to add, Andrew? If you'll let me piggyback.
Well, yeah, because I'm almost dumbfounded, and it's because the experience of Christianity here in the United States is almost 180 degrees from what the two of you have described. I don't think Donald Trump's a big secret. All right. And by the way, this is the following paragraphs. If you're a Christian reaching for your mute knob, for the mute button, don't. I'm not about to start bashing Donald Trump. But I will say that we live in a day in the United States of incredibly partisan politics. And those politics are drawn largely along Christian lines. And when we talk about foreign aid in the United States, right now it is the president and his Christian supporters who have said we need to stop foreign aid. We're in a period of increasing nationalization in the United States, and it is by and large the Christian right calling for that. Just recently, there was a push to stop transgender military service, pushed largely by the Christian right. I was at dinner with a member of the LGBTQI plus community a couple of nights ago, and she is appalled by the lobbying effort from the Christian right that is attempting to take back some of the gains that the LGBTQI plus community won over the last few years. Right at the end of Barack Obama's presidency, the Supreme Court ruled on gay marriage and gave homosexual marriage the same privilege as heterosexual marriage. But there's no guarantee that is going to stand now. And here's another one. In the news every day, the Roe v. Wade decision. So you guys may or may not know that, but that's the landmark decision about abortion in the United States, a woman's right to her own productive health. That landmark case that has stood for 40 years is very, very in jeopardy because of the appointment of two Christians to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so the things that you say about Christianity, all of that, to say that the things that you say about Christianity that are true for the UK are things that I wish were true for the United States, but they're not.
Yeah, I think you go, Tom.
I was just going to say that I think one of the things that I think of when I hear that is, and this resonated with me when I was meeting people, is I think certainly with British Christians, or the Christians that are in and around my area, because bear in mind, my experience was it was very narrow. I mean, I didn't really move more than 20 miles from my house. That was kind of the point. Obviously, it's the clues in the title of the show. It's things that I could be doing, but I'm not doing. So I had to keep it pretty local. That was part of the interest for me. So it is a narrow view, definitely. But I don't think you could easily pre-guess what the views of the Christians you met would be. And I think that's a kind of strength of British Christianity. I think you could probably guess on a few core issues, maybe things around abortion and things like that. But politically, for example, I think you'd struggle to say, well, I'm meeting an evangelical Christian tomorrow. I know they're going to be conservative. I don't think you'd hit the bullseye if you were sort of playing a guessing game with British Christians, maybe in the same way that you might with American Christians. I don't know what the data is on that, but I'd imagine, I don't know what your view is, Matthew, that British Christians, even evangelical Christians, probably fall across the political spectrum in sort of less reliable ways than maybe the American Christians do. It might be more predictable in America what type of sort of, if you went issue by issue, what the answers might be. I don't know if that's true for you or not.
I completely agree with that. What this conversation has reminded me of is Nick Clegg, the Liberal Democrat leader who resigned. Was it a year ago or was it 2 years ago now? Must be a couple of years ago now. I don't know if you're familiar with the name, Andrew. So we've got more than two political parties here in the UK. So we've got the Liberal Democrats, who tend to be the third party after the Conservatives and Labour. And Nick Clegg, a couple of years ago, was the leader of the Liberal Democrats for a while in coalition government with the Conservative Party before we had the whole Brexit debacle, etc. But we won't talk about that. I voted for his party, knowing that he was a Christian, but him being a Christian didn't put me off voting for his party. I voted for his party on their policies, not on the religious belief of their leader. But when he resigned as a Liberal Democrat leader, he did insinuate during his departure speech that it's not easy being or in fact, I think his words were stronger than that. He practically said it's almost impossible to be a Christian in UK politics. I'm not entirely sure that that's true, because me as an atheist had no qualms whatsoever about voting for his party, and I'd have voted for him if he was my local candidate. He wasn't, so I couldn't vote for him individually, but I would have had no qualms voting for him individually either.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Was it Michael Fallon you're thinking of there, Matthew?
Have I misspoken?
Yeah, I think it was because he was
just
Christian
Nick Clegg
leader
was the previous one, wasn't it? Yes.
Yeah, I remember that period, and it was interesting, wasn't it? Because he had to sort of, it was almost like he had to come out of the Christian closet almost, because British politicians don't talk about their faith. It was a really interesting thing. I remember that, and he sort of had to sort of talk about his faith, and it felt kind of awkward because he hadn't really done so before, and British politicians don't really talk about it, which is weird because Christianity is woven into the DNA of our politics in a way that it isn't in the States, whereas in the States they're endlessly talking about God being on their political team. So it's just like a sort of weird sort of.
And the thing that led up to his downfall, if I remember right, sorry, downfall is the wrong phrase to use here. That he got a lot of pressure over the gay rights things, because the Liberal Democrats' party policy is legalize gay marriage and equal rights for gays, or the whole LGBT spectrum. But there was a suspicion that his personal religious belief was that he didn't approve of homosexuality. But in his political voting and in his political statements, he always endorsed equal rights, and he never wavered from that. And he got a lot of criticism for this apparent conflict. I didn't read anything that gave me a firm impression of what his personal opinion was. I was interested in what his politics were, and his politics aligned with mine. I was cool with it. But there did seem to be this building pressure about a personal conflict there, and I think it just got to the point where he felt that he had no choice but to step down.
It's interesting because in the United States, we may have had, I think we just broke the long-standing record. I would have to double check this, but I think to date we have had one openly atheist member of the U.S. Congress. Absolutely no politician at a federal level will say on an open mic, open camera, I'm an atheist. In fact, Pew Research shows that in the United States, atheists are the least trusted social class in the country, below even that of convicted felons. And Christianity is the thing. If you're going to be elected in the United States, the one thing that you absolutely have to say, you don't have to say I'm with the president. You don't have to say I'm against it. You have to say I'm a Christian. You can't be elected otherwise.
Yeah, that's that. I struggle with that. I really do, because if I was standing for office, I don't know if I could lie like that.
I think it's changing. Maybe 2 weeks ago now, 3 weeks ago, I saw some Pew Research numbers that said that the nuns in the United States are now the largest segment of the population, but they're still within a statistical deviation of the Catholics. So they're both right at 23%. And so while the nuns tick slightly higher, statistically they're equal because they're within a deviation. But even with that, and maybe times will change where having to say I'm a Christian, or maybe that won't be a requirement much longer into the future. But if it's not, it will only have happened late in my lifetime.
Yeah, I think I saw something similar to you, Andrew. I saw an article, I think that was someone put out on Twitter, that America's the least religious it's ever been, and the youngest generation, or the two youngest generations within the kind of the generation part, if you like, are the least religious out of all the generations. So you assume that they're going through a similar trend that Western Europe's gone through. They're just maybe a few decades behind that. So it's interesting to sort of play a sort of hypothetical game to sort of imagine America in 50 years' time, and what state of play Christianity will be in that. I like to think about that, because I think we're obviously at a point where we are, we're probably not that many decades away from being even less religious, even less Christian than we are now. And there's obviously things you might gain as a country from losing some of your religious sort of bearings, but I'm also interested by what we might lose. My instinct is that Britain would lose some slightly different things if we really sort of forgot our Christian heritage. I mean, I don't know if you guys listened to the Unbelievable episode recently when Melvin Bragg was on there, talking about the kind of the importance of the maintaining some of the early sort of biblical translations. He's not a Christian. He's a famous sort of British BBC broadcaster, and he does his own podcasts and things like that, and he's always on the radio. He's great. He's a non-believer, but very passionate about some of the traditional stuff. I think we've got a kind of, in Europe, we've got an interesting problem, because a lot of the things we lose are very sort of heritage based and sort of historically culturally significant. Obviously our churches are 1,500 years old and things like that, and so we've got some really deep traditions that you could in theory lose over time if Britain became highly secular, like far more secular than maybe it is now, more akin to some of the other northern European countries. So it's interesting to sort of play that game with the States and imagine what it might lose or what it might gain in the future when it becomes even less Christian than it is now.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. And I've just reminded me the bit that I wanted to mention earlier, and I suspect it's more of a feature in the more rural parts of the UK, but where I think I slipped in one of the emails earlier, Tom. I throw it out as often as I can because it's so much good fun. I do amateur acting as part of my hobbies. And I do out of work, and I'm part of a fabulous group of people. We put on the plays twice a year, and we do it in a local village hall. And the village hall happens to be the hall that is next to the village church. So the village has got one pub, one church, one hall. So all the social events, or all the community events, all congregate around the village hall, which is connected to the village church. And quite a lot of the members of the village attend the church on a weekly basis, and that's part of their culture. If that hall wasn't there, wasn't being used, wasn't being supported, and supported by the church community as well as other communities, etc., we could lose it. If the religious use of that hall disappeared, what is left might not be enough to support the hall. It's that kind of thing, and that kind of picture is echoed in villages all across the country. So, if you go for extreme secularization, I'm not for 1 minute advocating extreme secularization, but the question is, what could we lose? We could lose quite a lot. Lose the hearts of some of our rural communities, some of which have been lost already through various other commercializations with, the village shop. People don't do the village shop anymore because they order online on Tesco, and that kind of thing. And that kind of eroding of community. Maybe the church is the last barrier for the ultimate death of some of these communities.
It's really interesting how you say that, Matthew, because I mean, in one of the episodes, I think it's episode 5, I talk more about community in that episode than any other. I meet some characters from a very local church to me, which is literally the communities outside my door. I'm in that community, if you like, and they have a very strong, almost old-fashioned, what I imagine what my grandparents talked about growing up in the valleys in Wales, sort of almost like they've recreated a sort of old-fashioned type community around their church. And I'm struck by, in London and across the UK, obviously, one of the things that we're doing politically, I guess, is we're removing sort of funding for things like children's centres. And that's happened for a long time. And we've stopped funding things like youth centres and children's centres via the public purse. And the way that Britain sort of funds those things has changed, sort of, the public way that we fund them. And what struck me was going to places like the Evangelical Church and some of the churches near me. They offer a lot of that provision. Now, it's not the same, and it obviously comes with a Bible message and all that sort of stuff. But nevertheless, the church is offering things for mums and dads and toddler groups and youth clubs and all this sort of stuff. And they can self-fund it because they don't rely on public funds necessarily in the same way. Certainly the church I'm talking about doesn't. So they're not necessarily filling a gap, but they're staying committed to certain types of provision for Christians and non-Christians that other parts, the sort of secular or maybe the public funding parts of British culture is actually pulling out of and we're retreating from. And so the church, again, it sort of seems to be playing a sort of increasingly important role in providing certain things that, as a country, we've decided not to fund anymore.
I'd like to push with that just a little bit. I do think that Christianity provides an important social structure for a lot of people, right? In fact, when I was talking earlier about what drives people to say their prayers at night and get up and go to church on Sunday, one of those things is that sense of community, right? We talk about it over and over and over. Where do skeptics get their sense of community? And there's been a lot of talk about how to do that with skeptics, and I think more and more skeptics, atheists, and sort of the nuns are building a social network of their own. But if we are to be successful as a group of our own, I think that we do have to be quite generous in our outreach, because it is the case that Christianity gives quite a lot. Now, I think the truth about that giving is that the vast majority of Christians don't give 10% of their income or anything like it, right? And depending on what New Testament denomination you're a part of, you might even think you should give 20 or 25% or whatever. Most people don't do that. Most people are offering $10 or $20 on Sunday mornings. But for skepticism to survive as a social framework, not just a worldview, we have to be that same giving group. We have to be willing to organize around, things like community centers, right? Because sometimes those are built privately here in the U.S. as well. And so Christianity does have an important role to play, and that role is increasingly social. And as skeptics, that's something we can learn. we will have to replace Christianity. We've got to replace those things with equally good giving.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, to give my own personal situation a heads up, my wife and daughter go to church every Sunday. They're both Christians. When I left the faith, my wife remained a Christian. So they go to church every Sunday. They have that Christian social bit. I stay at home. It's usually the time that I devote to editing the latest podcast or something like that. And it's a change in community service. You know, sometimes when a new person turns up at the church, my wife will come back and she got reported. You know, someone said to her, "Is there no Mister around?" You know, and that's a question to ask because I'm conspicuous by my absence, and it changes the face of social interaction.
It does, and there are really good atheist groups that spend a lot higher percentage of the donations that they receive on just doing good works. Right? They're not printing tracts. They're not handing out Bibles. They're not erecting monuments. They're not doing any of that kind of thing. They're doing disaster relief aid and that kind of thing. So that does exist, and we've got to do a little better job of making sure that people know that losing Christianity doesn't mean losing sort of what Tom was talking about, that idea of generosity and sense of community and that kind of thing.
Yeah, the thing though is those things aren't fully replaced in the rural parts of the country. You know, I'm in a small town in rural Somerset. You know, if I want to go and locate an atheist or skeptic group for that kind of thing, I have to go to Bristol, which is 30 miles away from me. I can't do that at the drop of a hat of an evening or on a Sunday morning because that takes time away from my family. So I need to prioritize. And you know, when I'm not working, the priority is my family.
It's interesting, and I it's a really this is one of the most interesting trails of thought I think I'm enjoying this sort of part of the conversation because I feel like for me it's one of the big things that I left sort of questioning was what can be learned from the way that Christians build communities. I'm not sure what I think about what I'm about to say, so I don't think I've got a solid idea on it, but I'm interested to put it out there for you two to think about as well.
It's written in stone now, bud.
Yeah. You're going to be quoted on this for the rest of the eternity.
Yeah.
By the four people who are listening.
Yeah. But it's I wonder how much of to do something it's very similar to what Christians do, where they combine community, they combine sort of some of that sort of giving and that generosity of spirit, but they also it's also in an atmosphere where you can talk about quite sort of complex ideas, which I think is almost the missing cog for me that you don't get. I think you can not replace, but you can replicate decently some of the community stuff where you bring people together. Community centres, rugby clubs do this. I grew up in Wales. Rugby clubs are a big thing. Sports and things like that replicate a lot of that stuff. I think one of the things that is hard to replicate is the going to a place that has all of those things, but is also a place where you can talk about sort of quite complicated ideas, like maybe suffering or loss or grace or things like that. I think if you went to a lot of sports clubs and started talking about that stuff, you might get laughed out of there. So I think there's something interesting about the boxes that Christianity can tick, if you like, to put it in a crude way. And the question I left thinking is, does it need to be religious in order for it to do all of those things? Can you bring people together and keep most of those elements in a non-religious way, or does it have to be religious in order for it to contain something philosophical, have the community, be the generosity of spirit, be a social club, be all of those things? I think you can create versions of them that are separate, but to have something that is all of that, I wonder whether the religious thing is the only way to do that. I don't know if I've got an answer to it, but I'd be interested in what you do think of it.
It's a great question. I think there are things which adequately replicate some elements. like the drama that I do. Fabulous group of people. We have a great laugh. We work really hard putting on a show, and we talk nonsense as well. Rehearsal nights are not just focused on what we're doing. We'll banter, we'll chat. We'll do that if someone's having a bad day. They'll say, "Oh, I'm having a bad day. I've got this problem at work," and those kinds of things. We don't go into the deep philosophies of life, obviously, but there is a community aspect to that. And show week, when we do it, it's every night for about 8 days. Once you add in the various technical rehearsals, dress rehearsals, and then the show nights, and so we're in each other's pockets for a significant chunk of time in that week or so. And so if anyone is having a poor day, a bad day, because that will happen to some of the people on at least one of the days, it gets picked up on, and we help them out and bunk them up or whatever. And of course, then the audience are there, and they're all on your side. And for the audience as well, it's a similar thing. These are community people, most of whom know each other, so they catch up, have a chat. And I had that with the last one because I was at front of house for the last one that we did, so I got to engage with our audience in a way which I hadn't done so before, because I'm normally either backstage or on stage. And so that was good fun, and it was good to have all those conversations. But yeah, it doesn't meet all of the requirements, but certainly some. And for a time I was a member of a camera club, and it was very much the same story there as well. It meets some of the criteria, but not all of them. For the philosophy, I don't know, you'd have to find some kind of club that does it. Again, because religion has got such, or Christianity specifically, has got such our culture, the history of England is so immersed in Christianity, and it's had such a long time to build up this infusion into our culture. It's much more settled. And I think other kinds of conversations, philosophy and science and all that, the focus on those subjects is enjoyed by a fewer number of people. And so you're only going to find those really in the cities, where you want people to move around that. And I don't think those will filter out ever into the rural communities, because not everybody is that interested. And those that are, there's so few of them, it's not going to be worth it. They might not even know they exist.
I wonder if so part of the problem that we're having, I think, is, at least in the United States. So I know it's very different where you guys are. And so I'm only talking about the way I experience atheism where I am. But I think one of the things that makes it hard to experience atheism in the way that a Christian experiences Christianity is that atheists are scared to raise their heads here, because the social isolation that is possible just on the back of that statement, "I'm an atheist," is quite deep. So it may very well be that if there were as many of us open as there are as many Christians open, these problems would be easier to solve. I don't think it would look like Sunday church. But the support that people get from Sunday church, I don't think has very much to do with church. I think it has more to do with the people that you sit with in the pew. So church gave you a place to meet those people. Right? There's no doubt about that. But, when I blow a tire out on the interstate late at night, I don't call the church. I call the person that I sit by in the pew and say, "Hey, I'm really, really sorry to wake you, but I've got an emergency and I don't have roadside assistance," or, whatever the case is. My wife's sick and my car won't start and I've got to get her to the hospital. It's not church that does those things, but the people that we're close to. And so it may well be that, that there are ways to build those communities where it doesn't look like church. And I think part of the reason church is having a problem is sorry for this to you guys and the listeners, but Facebook has given the world a way to communicate that isn't church, right? Now, I'm not suggesting that's the best way to communicate, but people feel more connected now than we ever have before. So I don't know that I have the answer either, but I think it is possible to imagine a world pretty easily that doesn't have Christian church, that has all of the benefits except the one where you feel like the cosmic creator is smiling down on you.
Interesting you mentioned about needing help and assistance. Yeah, obviously, if you need specific help and assistance, like your car's not working and you're 100 miles away from where you need to be, you're going to need someone with specific skills and abilities in that department. But other more nuanced needs, I can give you two examples, and they only came about because of connections with the church. And maybe there's a way these needs could be resolved without having to rely on the religious community structure. I'm struggling to imagine it, and purely because having a connection to a religious social structure gives you connection to so many people very, very quickly. And I think that's where the power is. So the two examples I'm going to give you, and they both go back to when I was still a Christian. So they go back 15 and plus years. One was, my wife and I were childless at the time. We planned a really large holiday. We went off to Australia for 4 weeks. A couple of weeks before we were due to go, somebody in the church contacted us and said, I know you guys are going away. You've planned this thing. I've got this need. A single mother with her young daughter. They need somewhere to stay for Christmas. Can they use your house? And we and we said, well, yes, actually, because our house will be empty for 4 weeks. Yeah, we're quite happy for so we met her and we sorted it out. And so because of that connection, we provided free accommodation for a single mum and her daughter for a period over Christmas and New Year at a time when they needed it. And we were only able to do that because somebody in the church knew what we were doing, knew what our plans were, and was ballsy enough to come straight out with the request. And the other scenario was I was chatting to some online friends group, and one of them mentioned a girl he knew who was in an abusive relationship and was seeking to get out quickly, and was just trying to look at options on where to go. So I basically gave a message and said, here's my address. If you need any help, you're worried about yourself, just park your car on my drive, bang on the door. I will find you somewhere to stay that night. And I knew I could be that confident because of the connections with the church. And I knew that within a few phone calls, I would be able to provide her with somewhere to sleep there. Nobody who she was afraid of would know where she was. And again, both of those scenarios, that didn't happen in the incidentally. No, another route was provided, so my offer never needed to be banked. But both of those scenarios, I could only be confident about the outcomes from those scenarios because of my connection to a church where people could ring people and someone would know someone who had a spare room or a bed or whatever to sort it. If without that connection to the church, I think it would be much harder to provide that kind of instant community support.
That's certainly that it's interesting. Yeah, that the sort of local Christian culture that I was talking about earlier has a very similar flavour near me. The one where I live in Kingston is that one of the women who I interview in the series called Val. She used a phrase which chimes with your story, Matthew. She referred to it as her and her community, they're in each other's lives, and it really jumped out to me because I didn't quite know I knew what she was saying, and it wasn't until she said that it really struck with me what I was sort of observing, and it was that just being in each other's lives, having a really established network. They've all got WhatsApp groups and they meet on Wednesday night, and it's all those informal things. And we've spoken a lot about some of the kind of the institutional side of church and secular life, the sort of the charity world versus what a Christian can offer, versus what a similar institution might be offered secularly. But the strongest thing for me is those informal kind of ties. But I think you're right, Andrew. I think that the social media has a role to play in that for sure. But for people who aren't really into social media, someone like myself, who I don't use it to sort of develop relationships in that way.
Yeah, I don't either. I'm rarely. Sorry, go ahead.
The way that Christians are in each other's lives in a day-to-day way. One of the women she had an operation on her knees whilst I was sort of with that church, and they all rallied round and started cooking her meals. And so she got meals delivered to her house, I think every night for a number of weeks after she came out of hospital. Now they didn't sort of means test it like you would do if you're a British charity, or they didn't sort of write a business case like you would if you were sort of like a donor-based charity model. They just kind of did it. and there's that kind of easiness, lightness to the way that you can do stuff, I think, informally, in when you have those kind of networks that Matthew's talking about, that I was also quite struck by. And as someone who moves to somewhere like London, if you don't come with a network, and, I've lived in London for 10 years, and I wouldn't have got close to develop. I've got really good friends, but I wouldn't have got close to developing that sort of network. I maybe imagine my experience of living in London would be very different had I, on day one, joined a local church. I wouldn't do that, and I still wouldn't do that now for myself, because of other reasons. But I think your life would be very different in some ways if you did. Your networks would be very, very different, and the way you'd be in each other's lives, I think, would be quite different, as opposed to someone who doesn't.
Yeah, it could well be. When I was back in the early part of this century, I was taking martial arts in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I eventually so there was a lady my age that had 2 children in that school as well, and I've done various martial arts through most of my life. But anyway, so we'd been in school there for 3 or 4 years at this same martial arts school. And I eventually ran the school and taught martial arts there before I left Charlotte. But this lady, and I don't feel like I can safely use her name or her kids' names, because she ran from a relationship, and the guy was he was actually a drug importer. So he didn't sell drugs on the street. He was eventually convicted and is now out of prison. But he was actually importing drugs from Colombia. So he's not a good dude, right? And she needed away from him, and she needed away from him in a hurry. And so she came to me after class one night, sort of out of the blue, and said, "I'm leaving my husband. I'm scared he will hurt me. And I need a place to go tonight." So me and my family at the time, we gave her a place. We parked her vehicle in our garage, closed the door, and she and the kids stayed with us for a couple of days. She was an engineer. She had plenty of money. She just needed a stepping stone out, right, so that she could sort things out with the authorities and get a restraining order and all of that jazz. So I think these sorts of human connections happen organically, but we just need large enough groups for them to happen. And I honestly don't know how to do that in a non-church environment. How do you convince 300 atheists to show up to anything? I don't know the answer to that, and how to get them to do it, on a regular basis, so that we can do things like, oh my goodness, here's somebody that I've sat with, week in and week out for a little while, and they just need help, right? I'm not sure exactly how to close that gap, but it is one that that would have to be closed.
It is interesting though, and I like that example you give. I'm no sort of martial arts expert, but I've also sort of been part of some clubs over the years in London.
I don't claim expertise either, by the way.
But well, you ran the classes, so yeah. So kudos to you for that. But I've been to a few clubs, and specifically certain types of martial arts, like, for example, if I'm thinking of some of the best clubs I've been to. Martial arts like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for example, it has a certain, because it's such a close contact martial art and people are so sort of bumping up against each other, literally, they're rolling around on the floor. There's something quite sort of, it creates a bond in those groups. And I think there's something, you've hit the nail on the head there. I feel that this needs to be something really compelling at the center of whatever it is. And I think the thing that makes me draw a line, or dotted line, it's not a straight line, but between martial arts and Christianity, I think martial arts has something going for it in that sense, because there's something really quite compelling about martial arts for people. It comes not just with a set of technical things, and it's obviously got health and fitness and all that sort of stuff, and you feel great after. If you've ever done a session, as you'll know, Andrew, you feel fantastic afterwards. But it also does come with a history and a philosophy, and you can, if you're that way inclined, tap into some of that stuff as well. So it's actually not really a bad example of something that's got real potential and does actually bring people together, because it shares something, I think, with Christianity and other religions, where it's got some sort of other elements. It's not just like going to a gym where you just pound the weights and leave. It's got a sort of a mythology behind it. It's got the technical stuff. It's got the health. It's got a brotherhood or a sisterhood or whatever. It's got all that stuff in it. So it's actually quite an interesting. I'd not thought of that before until you mentioned it, but there is some interesting links between the two.
Well, and I wasn't going through the background to claim a particular martial arts history. It was just, I think the point was that it was something that we were doing together. Really, what I was trying to get to is this is a thing that we did, 2, 3, 4, 5 nights a week together, and so it did give us that common bond where we knew each other, and I think that can happen. It doesn't have to be martial arts. Matthew gets that sense out of community acting, and after his last play. So here was Matthew. I think I said this to you when we were talking over lunch one day. After the first call, when you'd wrapped up that weekend, I could tell a difference in just how happy you were that you were able to participate with that new acting group, right? And it was really clear to me that you got a great sense of community out of that, and that these were people that you were able to to share a real common interest with, and probably people that you, I don't know, so now I'm sort of speaking for you, but I got a sense that they were people that you felt like you could rely on at some level.
Absolutely, and people who I wouldn't know any other way.
Yeah,
they're not people who cross my paths under any other part of my life.
Yeah, and so the question is, because Tom, I think you're right on the money about. So we've got these ideas that are sort of at a small scale, right? A martial arts school or a community acting troupe or a book club or whatever, and the question is how to give all of those things that enriched sense of community that Christianity sort of carries with it. I don't have a great answer.
No, I don't. Christianity's had such a long run up to doing it, and it's in most cases it's got it quite well tuned, and alternative methods that aren't religious just haven't got the same history and the same groundwork to do it. So Christianity's at an advantage, and that's probably why many atheists are very happy to go to church and engage with that. It gives them that community. I tried it for a couple of years and came to a point where the things that went on, certainly in the service part of the church, I was so familiar with, I actually wanted a break from those. And so I attend church occasionally, a couple of times a year, usually around Christmas. So yes, unfortunately, I am one of those people who you will occasionally see in church on Christmas. So that tagline, beat the Christmas rush, go to church now. Maybe I'm the person that's applying to. But and occasionally my wife will say to me, well, what was church like for you today? You've not been for 18 months and you've gone again. And I'll say, well, yeah, there was nothing that I hadn't heard before, but the community singing, I kind of miss that. And and then the chat over coffee afterwards, I miss that too. Those are the two things. Like every time I go to church, I come away and I go, you know what? I may be a terrible singer, but a community sing-song is a really good way of upping your spirits. Though there's value in just doing that, regardless of what I think of the lyrics of the songs that are being sung, and chatting with a friendly face with a cup of tea and a biscuit afterwards. There is value in that as well.
Yep. So, fellas, I wonder if you'd mind me shifting gears. There's a topic that has been burning on my mind about your experience, Tom. Yeah, yeah.
Windows, Tom. The answer's Windows.
Well, maybe so, because I'm suspecting that the answer to this question is a fail. So the answer probably is Windows, actually, but we're going to try anyway. So one of the things that the listeners will never forgive me for is if I don't ask the question about a spiritual conversion experience, right? And about whether on this great journey that you took, and I think it probably was a great journey, right? I mean, there's some, it was eye-opening about Christianity and why people do it, right? And so one of the burning questions about Christianity is, did you have any experience like that? And did you see any of the kind of confirmation miracles that Christians often claim? So not all Christians claim modern day miracles, and I'm not trying to pin that on everyone. I'm just wondering if you saw anything that you thought someone else might count, even if you didn't, as a confirming experience that leads you to believe that there's a benevolent personal creator out there looking to bend the will of the universe for those who believe in him.
The short answer is no, I didn't. I don't think I really got close to anything resembling...
Told you it was Windows.
Close to resembling that for myself. I mean, the closest I got in this series is, or just in part of my journey is the kind of the more liturgical high church type environments, those old sort of medieval churches that you go into, and there's something about the combination for me personally of the stained glass environment, the sort of, people call it smells and bells, the smells, the incense, and then that British or English choral music. That that combination of things does stir me in a way that the only other thing I can think of is Bread of Heaven ringing out in Cardiff when Wales are playing England in the rugby, and you look across and the whole stadium standing up and everyone's singing Bread of Heaven. The hairs on the back of your neck go up. That's the only other similar thing I can think of when I go into a really empty, quiet church, or an empty cathedral like Winchester Cathedral, which is often sort of, there's not that many people in there, and you kind of look up at the ceiling, and there's something awe-inspiring about that. I've never chalked that up to anything other than, there's something about my body chemistry that is wired for that to sort of excite in some way, so I never got to a point where it felt like anything more than that for me. I saw other people clearly, obviously, every time I go to church, you see people who are clearly, hands up in the air and eyes closed, and they're clearly connecting with something where they're not thinking those thoughts that I just thought. They're thinking something else. They're thinking about the connection they're having with the divine. But I personally didn't get close to that. I summarize, I think, in the final episode, I use the analogy with the Wizard of Oz, which kind of sums up my experience, really. And in some ways it's an open ending, but I do kind of clarify that, for me, it was a little bit like sort of, Dorothy pulling back the curtain and realizing that, or feeling like it's man-made. The wizard doesn't actually have magical powers. But it doesn't necessarily mean he's a bad person. There's that line in The Wizard of Oz, which I closed the show on, which is, Dorothy says, "You're a very bad man." And he says, no, I'm not a bad man. I'm just a really bad wizard. And I used that at the end because it kind of summed that up for me. I didn't come away thinking, the version of Christianity that I experienced was bad, but I didn't come away thinking it was magical in any sense, or it had any supernatural element to it. I felt like I didn't understand all the elements to it. I couldn't talk you through each element individually and say, this is why I go into church and feel all inspired. I don't fully know everything, but I came away with a feeling that I kind of went in with in some ways, which is, I feel like this is probably, a human experience that people are having. But I still feel like that now. That hasn't changed really for me.
It's interesting because you talked about the feeling that you get, the smells and bells, right? And public libraries here in the United States are often big stately affairs, especially if you live in a cosmopolitan area. You got 300,000 or 400,000 people. The public libraries will be pretty grand buildings on the size of large churches, and you walk in, and libraries have that distinct old book smell, right? and that's a smell that I really like, right? I'm a lover of reading of books of all kinds, and I thought while you were saying, this sort of smells and bells experience, I could picture getting a lot of people together in a public library that has this sort of sense of grandeur to it, and we could all sing "Stairway to Heaven," and might get the same kind of that sort of internal sense of largeness, right? That sense of wellness and belonging to something that's a little bigger than we are. And I don't think that experience has to be, I don't think it has to come in a church, but it is a nice sense of belonging that goes along with Christianity. And I think you were right to say that, you get to see that with people, whatever they're connecting to, and they're raising their hands, right? There's a sense, that we all want to feel. And however we get that, it's nice to be able to reproduce it.
Yeah, essentially, well, maybe you've got a club there in the making, and you should follow through on that. That sounds like I'd join. I went to see Coldplay years ago, the British band. Sort of, I'd say, sort of at the peak of their powers when they were really sort of coming up, and they'd released a couple of albums, and they were just huge and everywhere, and people were singing their songs and stuff. And they used to finish their performances where they'd sing a song. I can't remember the name of the song, but it has the lyrics like "The lights will guide me home" or something like that. And Chris Martin would swing around this gigantic lamp on stage, and it was kind of this like epic moment. The music would build, and obviously everything was geared towards this thing. And then at the end, he'd pull down this huge lamp, and then the fireworks would go off. And I remember looking around. I think it was in Crystal Palace. The gig was. And I remember looking around at people, and people were having, it probably wasn't a religious experience, but it was as close to a religious experience as I've seen at a rock concert. It was, it was hands in the air, it was eyes closed, it was a sense of like, oh my God, we're all experiencing something amazing together. So yeah, I agree with you. I think it's not something that has to be in a church. I've had it at sports events. I had it also in a church. It's interesting why we have that kind of experience all together. I don't know why we do have it, but we do, and it's a nice thing to tap into.
It is. I've said this. The listeners will think I'm even stranger than usual after I say this, but I have said it in other places. I get that sense every so often when I write computer code. That sense of something working that just feels bigger than me, right? And so it'll be that kind of thing that's hard for other people to identify, because most people can't imagine writing computer code. But we can get that feeling out of the things that we love, right? And so, and maybe that feeling's unique to Mac users, Andrew. Matthew, I don't know.
No, I'm sorry. I need to jump in for a count on here. I have had the experience of writing code and then it running perfectly first time, and that is a glorious moment, almost
it's a magic feeling,
religious.
Isn't it?
It's it is. It's a proper fist punch, fist whatever, up in the air, up on the chair.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
I can only imagine, but unfortunately, I've never done that. But yeah, I can only imagine.
And I'm not talking about the Hello World program. just clarification.
You mean Windows will run a program other than Hello World?
Yes.
It's okay. I'm sorry. We'll leave that. So, Matthew, I get the sense that we are wandering our way to a close. Am I wrong?
No, no, you're not. It feels that way. There was just one question to rewind a few moments, Tom, when you were talking about some of your experiences, and Andrew asked about spiritual experiences, and you said no, but you talked favourably about the human experiences. Could you? Well, you're obviously planning a series 2, which incidentally I am looking forward to. So you're working on that, but when that's done, could you imagine yourself continuing to go to church to experience those human connections?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to say, I do still go to church under slightly different circumstances. So my wife, similar to you, Matthew, my wife's a Christian. So when I was doing the life experiment, I deliberately didn't go with her because I kind of wanted it to be my own thing. So I didn't used to go to church with her before the life experiment. So I was never a church goer. I was obviously whilst I was doing it, but in my own space. And where I've arrived at now is that I kind of go with her and look after the kids, and just so that she can go and stuff like that. And then some, every now and again, she'll offer to look after the kids, and I'll go in and watch the service and stuff like that. And I still get a kick out of it. I really enjoyed the stories and kind of like the parables, especially, because obviously a lot of them are just, you can basically, transfer a lot of the wisdom in there into your sort of everyday life if you do a little bit of legwork. So yeah, I still go to church now. I would consider maybe after a little break into something quite different. So I wouldn't. I thought for a while maybe I'd go and do something like Islam or something next, or Buddhism or something. But
that was exactly where my mind was wondering about.
Yeah, I really want to break from. I really want to break from something overtly spiritual, I think. So I wouldn't do coding either. So I'll do something quite different, and then maybe I would look into something spiritual down the track again, but probably nothing to do with Christianity. I think it would have to be something sufficiently different in order for it to be interesting, I think.
Yeah. So is there anything left from Unbelievable? So one of the interesting things, actually, I thought I should have said this up front, but one of the interesting things was that you managed to catch the eye of Unbelievable like quite early on, right? In your podcasting career, and so congratulations there. It was well produced enough that a podcast that gets millions of downloads a year took notice right away. So whatever we said up front, I think that's the real testimony to how well done it was.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't claim all the credit there. I'd have to sort of confess. So interestingly, so me and Justin kind of knew each other before I started. So I originally took the idea to Justin years ago and said I was thinking about this, and we never quite managed to work out doing it together. But I sort of took this idea as an Unbelievable fan, if you like, and said, I've got this idea about maybe actually walking in Christian's shoes, and what could that look like? And we had some great conversations, and we sort of stayed in touch after that point. So that's why I thought maybe of including his church in episode 3. So Justin turns up in episode 3 of Hiding in Plain Sight. And so I was lucky enough then for him after he listened to the series to say, actually I've got a spot on a show. I'm thinking about putting it out. So it wasn't just off the back of my production value. It was, me and him had a relationship beforehand and through, as I've just said. So yeah, it was but it was lucky. Yeah, it was a good thing. And interestingly, obviously it gave me exposure to a lot more listeners because, as you said, Unbelievable gets so many downloads. So I've been very lucky on that front.
Yeah, and Justin is quite a fair-minded guy. You may or may not know that our team wrote a response book to Justin's book, Unbelievable.
Yeah, I remember. Yeah. I remember him mentioning that on one of the shows, actually. And it was only when Matthew reached out that I kind of put the two things together.
Yeah, and not only so, Justin's very fair-minded. He was willing to share his book up front with us. He gave us equal airtime. He offered us a spot on Unbelievable. So he is a very fair-minded guy, and it's something that I like to point out when I can. And so thanks to Justin for interacting with both sides of the community with fair-handedness.
I'd like to echo those sentiments and those thanks to Justin.
So, Tom, after listening to what was done on Unbelievable, is there anything else there that you'd like to say? Are there some wrap-up thoughts about the Unbelievable show itself? Because this is, after all, still Unbelievable. Is there anything that we ought to know that we haven't talked about up to this point?
The only thing I'd say, I think, Matthew, you alluded to when you talked about you went to church for a couple of years after and then kind of stopped. I don't know what your sense is, but mine is that, we've spoken quite rightly, and we focus a lot on some of the positives of Christianity, which I think is important. I think we should always try and especially, I feel as a British Christian, or as someone who lives amongst British Christians, we have such a there's so many strengths to its bow, as well as some of the negatives, that it's worth reminding ourselves of those strengths a lot. But we have spoken a lot about them. But I think there is a natural point as someone who's a non-believer, that when you go to church, and I experience this now, you get to a point where the narrative is so geared towards the idea that you need to be in Jesus, as people talk about, that there comes to a point where you kind of need, I at least feel, you kind of need to stick or twist, to use a sort of poker saying. You kind of need to sort of either do it or don't do it. I feel like I was listening to an unbelievable show the other day. It was really interesting, actually, about I don't know if you guys heard it, the mythicist guy who was on there, the guy who just goes to church.
I know the one.
But yeah, it was really interesting. I'd never come across that as an idea before. I wish I had, actually, going into my thing, because there's some parallels there. But for me, I think I'm not sure I get the whole mythicist thing. I think I like going to church, but I don't think I could comfortably, for me, label myself a sort of Christian by name, and sort of, I think what I'm trying to say is, I think the beliefs are fundamental to it. I'm not convinced that, I think, that phrase, you get rid of someone's devils and their angels go as well. I think, if the beliefs are they are the difficult bit, but I think you kind of need them to really engage with Christianity in a meaningful way. I find myself sometimes feeling a bit awkward that I'm the person in the room who doesn't believe. That's not because people around me are being funny about it. They're absolutely not. They're incredibly welcoming. It's all about my perception of my role within the church, because it's all geared towards being in Jesus, and you're not. At some point, it feels like you've kind of, as I said, you've kind of got a stick or twist on it. So it's a very inclusive religion, but at the same time, intellectually, it can be quite exclusive, I think.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's funny that you mentioned that particular episode, because my wife and I don't very rarely listen to Unbelievable together. We listen to it separately. I'll listen to it when I'm on my commute to work, and she'll listen to it when she's doing a run. But that particular episode, that weekend we were going up to see family, so we put it on and listened to it on the drive up. And we got to the end of it, and we both said exactly the same thing. We said, "Why does he do it?" And it was a stick or twist. She's stuck, I've twisted, or the other way around, whatever. And neither of us got how he is happy in the conclusion that he's come to. Actually, I tell you what, it's the old parable of Jesus of, you either be hot or cold. If you're lukewarm, I'll spit you out my mouth. And it was that struck in my mind when I got to the end of that episode. I really struggled to engage in it. I would love to ask him that question and talk to him about that and why he's happy in that, because I can't imagine being happy in that situation, which is why I don't go.
He'd be an interesting guy for you to have on, wouldn't he? I think he spoke really well. That would be such an interesting person to be able to spend some time with. I think it was. Okay. Yeah, I agree. It was a really interesting story.
Yes, he was. I think there's so much more that he could say that would be interesting to listen to. Any other thoughts you want to throw out, Tom?
No, I just appreciate both your time. I've really enjoyed the conversation, so thanks for having me on. It's nice. It's sort of, although it's maybe slightly self-indulgent of me to take
it. Be self-indulgent.
Reflect on my reflection, because the whole series is a reflection, and then I'm spending more time reflecting on it. It's sort of, I'm disappearing down a rabbit hole of just endless self-reflection. So at some point I've got to stop. So, but it has been nice, nevertheless, to sit down with people after doing the series and stuff, and think about it in a more casual way. So so thanks.
Excellent. Any thoughts, Andrew?
I'll use my closing thoughts to just remind the listeners that there's a new feature that goes along with each of our podcasts. So in the show notes, one of the things that you can do is click on the link to leave us an audio message. And whatever your device is, whether you're using an Android device or an iPhone, a Windows device or a Mac, and you should always use number 2 and number 4 of those, the iPhone and the Mac. But whatever device you're using, open the show notes in your podcast app, touch that audio link, and you can leave us a message. It can be a message of agreement or disagreement. If you like or dislike something you've heard, you can just reach out and say hello. By all means, ask us a question, say hello to Tom. Don't forget Tom's website. We're going to give him an opportunity to give that again here in just a moment. But one of the important things about Still Unbelievable, and one of the things that we want most, is your feedback so that we know what you're interested in and what you want to hear next. So open up the show notes and click and leave us a message.
Awesome. Thank you both. Yes, Tom, I echo that. It was a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed the last couple of hours. It's and I am honestly looking forward to whatever it is that you come up next. And if it happens to be on point, maybe we'll come back and have this conversation again. If you do find yourself edging over Somerset Way, please do get in touch. I'm sure there's a cider that you haven't tasted yet that you'll be converted onto.
Well, I miss Rattler. I did a cycle through Somerset years ago, and so I'd be well up for a pint of Rattler at some point.
Oh, excellent. My favourite is Bee Sting, which I can get in the centre of Bristol, and yeah, that's a good pint that is. But you got to keep the numbers low.
Right.
So yeah, it's genuinely been a pleasure. Really enjoyed your podcast. Really enjoyed chatting away. It's been brilliant. And so over to you to give your final plug for where people can find you and your podcast, and we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, great. So obviously any of the podcast players that you use, it would be all in that. So search Hiding in Plain Sight. Or you can check out everything through the website, hipspodcast.com. Tweet me, especially if you're a non-believer. As I was saying earlier, there's probably less non-believers that I've had feedback from. So I'm particularly interested in your views. So at Tom Hips podcast is my Twitter as well, if you want to get in touch.
Awesome. Thank you all. And that's a wrap.